right. Welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Bridget Danette. I am the Vice Chair and the Director of the Resource Hub for the Guild of Scenic Artists. So if you aren't familiar with the Guild, we are a group of scenic artists who wants to share the things that we know and create resources for working scenics and kind of help foster a sense of community. So that's what we try to do with these webinars. Jamie is going to walk us through how to create a drop. And while she's talking, I'm going to serve as your moderator of sorts. So I'll be your little webinar tour guide. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat over to the side. So if you have any questions for Jamie as we're going, feel free to populate them in the chat. I will try to save all of those for the end. If there is something that I look at and I go, ooh, that looks time sensitive because we're on the exact picture that you have a question about, then I might interrupt Jamie and have her answer that question in the flow. But otherwise, if we don't get your question asked right away, I will hit you at the end when we have our little Q&A when we touch base. So without any further ado, I will let Jamie introduce who she is and what her presentation is going to be about.
Thank you, Bridget. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jamie Clausius. I am a scenic artist that is currently based in Madison, Wisconsin. And so just a little background about me. I'm studied at undergrad at Oakland University. I completed the 2-year program at the Scenic Artist Training Program at Cobalt Studios. From there, I worked at places like Lexington Children's Theater, Madison Children's Theater. I did some mural work for just a little bit at a big company in Wisconsin called Epic Systems. And for 5 years, I was the resident backdrop designer and scenic artist for Tobin's Lake Studios. And now I'm a freelance artist. And I'm also one of the fellow teachers at Summer Scene Painting at Cobalt Studios. So today we are going to be talking about creating a backdrop, mostly focusing on layout and cartooning, and a little bit of the beginning process of how you start to talk to designers and what all goes into literally the beginning to just before you start painting. So not a lot of the painting stuff. We'll still look at some pictures, but yeah, we're mostly focusing on the prep and going through up to cartooning. So how do you start painting a backdrop? So a backdrop is traditionally a flat painted piece of fabric with a painted design that's hung on the batten or traveler track. You can also use the backdrop as a dead hung element or moving on a traveler track either from side to side or up and down, depending on what your theater's capabilities are. The company you're working for, whether it's a theater or a vendor, such as like Tobin's Lake Studios would be considered a vendor that isn't actually attached to a theater, but I still painted backdrops full time for them. Sometimes I worked with outside designers. A lot of times I designed myself. So that's where some of the differences come, whether you're working with a designer or on your own. Some variables of a backdrop, some things that you want to ask your designer or director or technical director, such as what are the dimensions of the project? Does it have things like doors or windows cut out of it that you may be responsible for? Each theater and each organization kind of divides that workload up a little bit differently. Sometimes the sewing or costume department will take care of those things. Sometimes you'll be doing it yourself. I've definitely had to sew my own backdrops with very little knowledge at the time on how to sew backdrops. But it is something that you sometimes have to consider. Is the backdrop gonna be full stage? Is it gonna be borders or legs, which are on the sides of the proscenium usually? It may be a cut drop that may have netting or organic edges such as trees. Is it made out of unusual fabric, which may need to be treated differently than a regular muslin backdrop? Muslin is usually the standard for what we use, but a lot of times you might have scrims, you might have velours, you could have really funky fabrics such as different types of silks or poly, psych. There's really a lot of different types of fabric that you could be using. Are there lighting considerations where the lighting designer may need to be consulted periodically through the process, such as if your backdrop has a moon in it, does the lighting designer have to install a moon box behind it to help light that specific effect? Or are there lights turning on behind the drop that at night maybe it looks like buildings have windows turning on and lamps behind them and things like that? And are there several or many drops to the production? And that goes into obviously the question of time and budgeting. And these are all these sorts of things that you need to have conversations about before you get started. So talking about conversations with the set designer, the designer will be the person who realizes the design of the director, and that may be a separate person, or maybe it's you. If you are the set designer and the scenic artist, that may be beneficial in some ways, because then you can sort of play to your strengths. If you find that you really want to either try something new or have really honed a specific skill, you could possibly add that into the design. The designer will hopefully provide you with a paint elevation of the backdrop design, as well as a separate rendering. So hopefully that happens. Sometimes we only get one or the other. And the designer is also going to be the person who gives approval on final looks of the project, such as if you have a brick that is not necessarily articulated in the design of a brick wall, and you have to then ask the designer, do you have research looks for this, so that you can actually hone in on the exact look that you're hoping to achieve. And one important question to ask the designer is, what would you like to see different from the paint elevations that maybe the designer didn't know how to include? You really have to be the investigator through these projects. The designer may have been short on time. They may decide that they're just going to put a wash over someplace that really they want a whole lot more detail for, and you really need to be the person to ask those questions. And sometimes they're hard questions to ask, because you certainly are not wanting to judge anyone on what they're handing you, but you do need to get the information that you need to produce the large piece. So this is kind of going into realizing a set designer's vision versus your own design. The pictures that I have pictured here, the top rendering is actually from Tobin's Lake Studios, and they had a very specific problem that they had their renderings painted long before the internet was used by everybody. So they would have scenic artists that would be their designers and their scenic artists. So a lot of times these renderings would not be fleshed out all that well. They wouldn't look clean. And the renderings really were a very shorthand version for what the actual backdrop was going to look like. The backdrop really ended up much nicer and detailed than what you see on the top rendering. So part of my job was actually going through all the old renderings, and which is what the bottom picture is my interpretation of taking pictures of what our actual backdrops were and trying to, and they were all painted by different scenic artists. We had 7 or 8 paintings of this snow scene, and coming up with a good representation for what these backdrops look like, so that on the Tobin's Lake website, the rendering would actually match more closely to what the backdrop looked like. So it was sort of a reverse from what a lot of times we have to do with scenic artists. So coming back to what the slide is about, both instances, whether you're the designer or you are working with a separate designer, the design needs to be able to convey the idea to not just the set designer, but to the director, other designers such as the lighting and maybe even costume designers, as well as you as a scenic artist or people on your crew. An advantage to designing your own backdrop is you can work in some elements you feel are your strong suits. When using a separate scenic designer, the conversations around the design become more imperative to make sure that there is complete understanding between the designer and the scenic artist. And that's going down to the nitty gritty of, maybe the perspective is a little off. Would the designer like the perspective to be corrected? And maybe it's hard to see a specific like bunch of trees in a background that normally you would see. Would they like that articulated? So you really have to kind of think about what the final product is, as opposed to just what the rendering is being shown in front of you. When realizing your own design, try not to skimp or leave parts of the design unfinished, because you know what is needed, but maybe, people are very literal, such as if they don't see it on the design, they may not realize that it may or may not exist. And so being as clear and concise about your design is going to make everybody feel confident in the process. And as the scenic artist, your question asking skills are vital, and you need to really understand what the designer wants. Trying to take weird sort of concepts of, I want this yellow to be sort of an ochre, but also sort of smushy with some brown in it. And you have to just say, okay, let's try and, zero in on these weird amorphous ideas from one person's vocabulary to another. So, such as having reference books or images handy to help clarify what the designer imagines and what you actually need to paint, will help you fully understand what the intentions of the designer is. And then once you feel more comfortable with all these conversations, hopefully you have all your questions answered and you should make a plan of attack. So what I've shown you all here are some really great reference books that a lot of scenic artists have used for quite some time. They are just reference photo books by Judy A. Juracek. And there's, I actually think, even more options for, these are the surfaces, architectural surfaces, and natural surfaces books. Those are some examples of reference books. These are unfortunately becoming harder and harder to find on Amazon, but it's a good way to start. And a lot of people have used them as just examples of, here's an entire chapter just on bricks. Here's an entire chapter on architectural surfaces that are just cartouches and different types of capitals for columns. And your designer may or may not have articulated that in their design. And so it's really important for you to be able to go through and understand with the designer what we're looking for. So it's helpful to have an arsenal of visual research. The resources will help you communicate. So the scenic artist would also work with the designer on what certain treatments are to look like. The internet can be a worthwhile resource, but sometimes I still don't find what I'm looking for. So having not just the internet to look for, but also just having books that aren't even necessarily art books. I find a lot of really great pictures in wildlife, travel, and other architectural books. And sometimes just like poking around the bargain bin or even going to like half-price bookstores can really kind of like turn up a lot of things you wouldn't expect. So this is the designer rendering versus the paint elevation. And this is just a short little explanation of the difference between a paint elevation and a rendering. Generally, a paint elevation is going to show you exactly the color, the style, hopefully it's in scale. Sometimes it's not, but it should show you exactly what the image needs to be painted, whether it's on a floor or the backdrop or other scenic elements. Whereas the designer rendering is going to be an object that has actual all elements on it, such as lighting. Maybe it'll have characters for scale, and it may also have costume elements in it. So it's not as easy to paint from these because you have lighting put on it. So things that are dark in the rendering may not actually need to be dark when they are painted. They may actually have to be fully articulated with color. So the plan of attack. So to help you better understand the scope of the project you are about to undertake, you must make a plan of attack to break down exactly the steps and time needed to complete each task. So this is great because it's not only going to help you plan your time, but it's going to help you plan the process of your backdrop. So that way you're not just starting from day one saying, okay, here's my blank backdrop. How do I get started? You've actually thought through the process. And the process can change, and that happens quite often. But you really need to start by making an actual plan so that you know how your time is going to be allocated, maybe what kind of paint and tools you're going to be using, assess how many colors maybe you need to buy and how much of each, if you can, really zero in on that much detail. And what kind of tools will you need? And do you need to consider making or purchasing tools? Because all of that takes time. And in the end, as artists, we need to make sure that our time is really paid to ourselves as much as to other people on our crew, if you have the ability to do so. And some tools that you can make are lining sticks, bridges. Lining sticks are going to be a large, and there'll be a picture on the next page, I believe, or at least down the line. It's a long piece, usually of molding with a handle on it, and that's meant to draw your straight lines, throughout your drop. You can also use your snap lines as well, but the lining sticks help for a myriad of ways of painting and drawing straight lines on your drop. Bridges, which are pictured on the right here, are actually plywood with 2x4 that's actually cut with a hole underneath it so that air can actually be pushed under the drop while it's being starched. So these tools are actually installed under the drops, and they will make it so that you can put fans on the outside, and the fans can blow air under the drop as you starch. You can also make floggers. Bamboos you can cut down and actually manufacture and fit so that you can fit your brushes into them. Pounce bags can be used for drawing, and stamps and stencils are also things you can make, because so many times such as what's pictured here, this wallpaper that I had to make, I couldn't go out and buy that stencil. I had to project it. And in this case, I used rosin paper because I wasn't able to get my hands on craft paper at the exact moment I wanted it. So rosin paper and packing tape were used to basically laminate the rosin paper, and then I cut out the design with an X-Acto knife. So other tools you can make are paint carts, and a lot of these tools that I've made have actually come from Cobalt Studios. So there's the picture of the lining stick on the right that I was explaining to you guys. And I retrofitted a paint cart so that it could actually fit inside my car, because as a freelance scenic artist now, I don't actually have my own shop. So I have to think about everything packing down as tightly as possible into my teeny tiny car. So as you continue to plan, you need to think about the space that you're painting in. Is it going to be in a shop with other carpenters? Are you going to have to consider cleaning, like taking a day just to clean? Or can you negotiate with the shop and have the carpenters and the people who normally work in that shop clean for you? I found that a lot of times what they consider clean is not what we consider clean, but any time that they can give you back in these prep areas will really help, so that hopefully you are not spent cleaning up tons of sawdust or having to move tools around. I've had to walk into shops and just look, and luckily most of them had their tools on wheels, but unfortunately that meant that I on my own was just trying to figure out how to make space for the drop that I needed. You need to assess how long each step will take, and how many people you may be working with, and that can help you break down what the overall hours you will need to allot for the project. Such as maybe you've decided that, okay, I can use people on certain days and that can save me time. They'll obviously get paid for their time, but you don't want people standing around on your projects. So you need to assess, all right, do I need to have overhire coming in for just a few days? Or do I need someone with me this whole time because we've got a huge project and we're just gonna, work together the entire time to make it happen? If you're placing a bid proposal for the project, you'll be able to figure out how much money you will need to spend on labor, so everyone on your team gets paid a reasonable amount for their time and skill, including you. Obviously, we're all working on what is reasonable pay for skill and time these days, and there's no right answer to it, and certainly you just have to kind of figure out what you deem as an appropriate amount. And what will you be painting your drop on, such as the floor or on a paint frame? So that'll take us to our next project or our next section. So painting on a paint frame, is a very traditional method used by scenic artists. However, very few people have access to this method these days, but it is a really wonderful space saver in the shop. If you have a paint frame that is actually motorized and can either go into the floor or raise up into the ceiling, you will not have to worry about being on scaffolding or on, hopefully not on ladders. And or maybe if you have access to a scissor lift, those are really wonderful alternatives to paint up high. But this is kind of what the one example is for painting on a paint frame. When painting on a vertical surface, try to work from the top down, so you can always see what you've painted above you. And if there are any drips that occur, you can fix them as you move down the project, as opposed to having to come back and jump around. And then you can sort of keep your process more organized in your head as well, so that hopefully you're not spending more time trying to fix mistakes as opposed to moving on to the next process. When hung, the drop has nothing supporting it on the frame, and the fabric will bounce as you try and paint on it. So that is one of the challenges to get or go through as you, between painting on the floor or painting on a paint frame. And that doesn't necessarily become a hindrance after you've kind of gotten used to it. It does provide issues when you're trying to tape out masking, because you might not get a nice even contact with the surface if it's kind of, you know, pushing away from you as you're pushing on it. So that will also help inform what your process is going to be. Doesn't mean you have to mask in a different way. Doesn't mean you maybe just have to find a way to paint without masking in certain areas, because you just know that maybe spattering is more of a challenge. Maybe painting marble is more of a challenge because you would normally have gravity on your side when you're painting marble if you're painting on the floor as opposed to a paint frame. So those are some of the things to consider. Oh, and this is a video that was sent by Angelique Powers of her and a student, I believe, painting on a paint frame. So as you can see, they still do their best to staple and or attach it from as evenly as possible. It is a little bit more of a challenge to know if you are actually square as on a paint frame, but if you're working on it consistently, you have put usually 2x4s or 1x in the correct areas that you know will make your backdrop actually square to itself. And so painting on the floor tends to be more common. It can be more exact in a way to lay out your backdrop to make sure all its corners are square. And you do that by actually making a rectangle on the floor. And squaring your drop is important because if the geometry of your backdrop is not correct, it can encounter a myriad of problems when hung, such as having permanent wrinkles because the backdrop, I'm going to try and show you guys, is not parallel with its sides from top to bottom. It can actually become trapezoidal, which means that the top is actually shorter than the bottom, which can create problems, or the whole thing can go slightly diagonal if your rectangle that you've put your drop into is not actually square. Once the rectangle is drawn, your drop can actually be stapled along the exact edges of the rectangle. This would be the time that you would install your bridges. So before you actually attach your drop inside your rectangle, you would screw or nail your bridges into place first, and you actually put the drop, staple it above the bridges. So that way you've got your air able to flow underneath it once you start starching. Usually 1 or 2 per side is good, depending on the size of your drop. So starching is become or has been a very long conversation over the many years because there are many different ways to starch. But most of the time, if you have a natural fabric such as muslin, it will most likely need to be starched. And starching helps stretch and seal the fabric. And sealing the fabric will help brushes and tools slide more easily across the surface of the fabric, such as if this fabric is not sealed the paint will just travel through the fabric to either the back of the fabric or the paper that's behind the fabric. And that can make it really difficult for you to get a nice slick surface to kind of move your paint treatment easily. Other commonly used fabrics such as scrim or velours generally don't need to be starched. There are many different recipes for starching, and many scenic artists have different variations. So I'll at least tell you guys one that I'm most familiar with. Some materials that you can use to starch: you can use diluted Elmer's glue, diluted white house paint if you're in a bind, and you can also use grocery store liquid laundry starch. However, boxed Argo laundry starch has been the industry standard, though I will say that Argo laundry starch is becoming harder and harder to find. So a lot of artists are switching to other alternatives such as Argo cornstarch, which can be bought at the grocery store. But when the laundry starch is mixed with boiling water, it'll make a slick, hazy slurry, which is then brushed into the fabric to create a sealed surface. And I already went over the laundry starch. I went out of order, but that's fine. So the general process is you cook at least 3 gallons of water to boiling, or as hot as you can get it. And a lot of people are able to use convection, those little convection burners, or some people are lucky enough to actually have a stovetop that they can get near their backdrop. But a lot of us just have to use the hot water that comes out of the tap. So just get the water as hot as you can, because it is still starch. So if you've ever cooked with starch, you know the hotter the water, the more that those starch molecules are going to puff up and activate and create that binding slurry. So this recipe I've used is stirring a box of starch into half a gallon of cold water. Some scenics just use enough water just to create a liquid with the starch. Some may use a little bit more. So it's a lot of testing if you haven't done it before. So you then mix the cold starch mixture slowly into the boiling water. So the starch has time to activate in the boiling water and become the slurry that is needed for the starching process. A lot of times, 1 or 2 gallons of boiling water is also added to the original mixture, since most of us don't always have enough access to boiling water all at one time. So that's why some is added later. So that way, at least the starch is cooked and you can mix it with hot water. And then once the starch is cooked and the bridges are installed, if you're lucky, you should grab a buddy that is willing to help with the next part, which is spraying and brooming the starch into the drop, which means to evenly distribute the starch on the drop with a garden sprayer or Hudson sprayer. They can be very interchangeable in a lot of ways. Using a clean broom only used for starch. You don't use one that you've cleaned anything with, because you will then take all of those dust fibers and they will be permanently brushed into your backdrop. What will happen is the person will start spraying, usually in a 4 or 5 foot long path along the drop, and the broomer will broom in either an X or a figure 8 pattern, making sure not to avoid edges or webbing or pipe pockets. And watching out for holidays, which are empty, non-starched areas, because that will come through in certain treatments such as sprays. And to reference, if you'd like more information, because there's tons to be talked about with it, a great starch off recipe article is written by Angelique Powers and can be found on the Guild of Scenic Artists website. So are you ready to start drawing? We've talked so much about everything except for painting and drawing. So using the paint elevation of the rendering, you can do any prep work such as figuring out perspective of objects, or you may decide to grid to figure out how you're going to draw the image on the large scale project. A lot of times what I will do is make a photocopy of the paint elevation. That way I can stick a piece of tracing paper over it, or I can just draw on it directly. Do everything you can to keep the paint elevation absolutely spotless. Place it in a folder that has an acetate on it so that you keep it clean, because these may be the only copies, and you want those renderings to be pristine to hand back to your designer, as well as for you to work from. Many backdrops also have subtle clean lines, and having many eraser marks on the surface may not be covered up by spray painted applications such as in this picture, you see this is a big Bavarian village scene. Hopefully you can see it's obviously just drawn at this point. Any lines that I have going through the sky are very hard to cover up with just a very light treatment in the sky, such as clouds. So you want to make sure anything that needs to stay clean, you're keeping clean. And that is achieved a lot of times by making pounce drawings, which are another traditional method used by scenic artists to transfer an image onto the backdrop. And it's usually drawn on craft paper, or in this case, it's mostly rosin paper is what you all are going to see here. So this is still the same drawing that I was talking about before at the Bavarian village. So this is just rosin paper. And it's only 3 feet wide, so you see it taped a lot. The advantage of craft paper is I do think it comes in wider widths. A pounce drawing is a large drawing of craft paper or rosin paper, and it's taped together to equal the full size of the image. The drawings can be used for one area. You can use it to make repeating areas such as molding or wallpaper, or it could be the whole drawing of the design. So it doesn't have to be a full drop size drawing, but it also can if you need it to be. The drawing is then perforated with a tool called a pounce wheel or a rotary wheel, which is commonly used in costume making. And once completely perforated, a tool called a pounce bag is used to rub charcoal through the holes to transfer the image on the backdrop. And I apologize, I did a complete explanation of a pounce bag here because I did not have a picture for you. And it's just a homemade tool using muslin or cheesecloth. Powdered charcoal is put in the middle of a 1 foot by 1 foot square of fabric, along with cotton balls, and then it's gathered to form a ball with a handle to push charcoal through the holes in the drawing to transfer the image to the backdrop fabric. And then once perforated, you can use the drawing as many times as the paper will hold out. I think I may have missed one point of if you have the option, it's also a great idea to lightly sand the back so it will open up the holes and more charcoal will get pushed through all those holes and transfer that image that much easier. So perforating the drawing, oh, I think I put it in this section. So ideally, if you can move the drawing to a surface you can stand comfortably, that's best. That's me in the photo, and you see that it's a full stage drop, and I was the only person perforating it. So I did my best. I think I also picked up some Homosote sheets, which are a spongy compressed board sheet stock that is really ideal if you can get your hands on it for perforating, because the pounce wheel will pounce through the fabric and it has something to actually grab onto from behind, so your holes will be larger and they will be more consistent. So starting at one end of the drawing, use the pounce wheel or maybe a pencil with a push pin on it to reach areas to perforate all the lines. Be methodical, be patient, switch hands. In our industry, our ergonomics are very important. So using your one hand, one arm, one leg to do something repeatedly is going to cause a lot of issues in your body. So it's good to figure out how to be as ambidextrous as possible. And once finished, it's talking about sanding for your charcoal to pass through. And once you've perforated all your areas, you're about ready to transfer it to the drop. So some tools for large format drawing, as we've talked about, paper and tape, rotary wheels, chalk or chalk line. Gummy erasers can be useful sometimes if you really need to try and like get some schmutz off the drop. It can be really helpful just to take up like dirt and things like that. Floggers are good for erasing. The lining sticks we talked about. Bamboo is also good with charcoal, not just paintbrushes. Sharpies or markers, once you finally have your drawing correct, and you want to make sure that these lines can be seen through multiple layers of paint. Sharpies or markers are really great for that process. String or yarn, preferably a string that is not very elastic, can be used to make a grid without actually drawing a grid out on your backdrop or your paper. That's another way to draw without adding extra lines that you may have to compensate for later. T-pins or push pins that you would use to actually like pin everything in place if you were needing to either draw perspective. You can use push pins and wrap chalk line around it to make your vanishing point lines or your horizon line, whatever you need to try and do, quick perspective drawing tricks. Compasses, small link chain is really great to make sort of longer curved lines without actually having to plot it out. It's a really wonderful technique where you can lay the chain down, you kind of guide it into place with your bamboo because you want to stand as much as possible. Being on the floor is terrible for your body. So the farther back you can stand, you're also just going to be able to see what you're doing and see the image better. So you'll know if you're drawing more correctly the farther you stand back. The other great thing about chain is you can also kind of pull it from one end if you have it sort of right, that the curve isn't quite what you want. You pull it from one end and it just kind of corrects itself in a lot of ways. And it's really a fun tool to use. Plastic or skinny wood molding. You would need a friend for this because it's another way to draw these curves that aren't, things you can draw with compasses or are just so big that you just need these little tricks to kind of get confident, nice curves. Scale rules, tracing paper and pencils. Like it's sort of feel like an architect in some ways because you are, being as exact as possible, trying to transfer this drawing from the rendering to your full stage drop. And we're just going to do a quick introduction on translucencies just to like give you guys other ideas for, things that you may not have encountered before. We also do have more in-depth articles on the Guild site about translucencies and scrims, so please check that out. A translucent backdrop is a special kind of drop that is meant to be lit from the front and back. Most of this is from Cobalt Studios, so you can also reach out to them if you have more questions as well. Translucent backdrops transformations fall into several categories: augmentation, time of day, image transformation or radical transformation, and miscellaneous specialty drops. So I'll just go over this really fast explanation. Augmentation, the image does not change. Often the colors don't change. And depending on how saturated the paint is applied, the darker the area, the more opaque the paint usually is painted. And the lighter and more vibrant color, the more colorful the area is. Time of day is just kind of like what it sounds like. The image mostly stays the same, but the lighting effects on the image will change. Image transformation or radical transformation, which is sort of what we have here with the neon signs. When lit from the front, the neon should look turned off, which a lot of times that's just like unpainted muslin that's actually over where the neon areas are. And then when you light it from the back, you will actually have this bright painted area over that neon that will actually look like the neon colors are turned on once lit from the back. And miscellaneous drops, those are drops that may have opaque areas, which is a special type of paint that scenic artists will come up with different recipes so that when it's lit from the back, this paint is so dark and so thickly coated that the image will look like it'll go into silhouette. And this is one example of augmentation that I did at Cobalt Studios. When lit from the front, it's supposed to be a stained glass ship. So when you look from the front, you'll see some texture. You'll see a little bit of just paleness from being lit from the front. And then when it's lit from the back, the colors are to become more vibrant, and it's almost has a sunset, more of a sunset look to it than it did. When you're painting translucencies, a lot of times you will paint with different formulated paint or dyes that will help be able to be painted translucently as opposed to opaquely, because you want to be very specific about where you're putting your color and where you're putting your darkness. And then a quick introduction to scrims. A scrim is just a cotton mesh fabric that's used for lighting effects. And the fabric can also be painted on as long as it is painted in a way where the holes are not filled, unless that's the intention, because sometimes it is. It is not recommended to starch. There are a few different types. Natural shark's tooth scrim or painter's scrim is, if you do use starch on it, it's the only scrim that's known to shrink when sized. Bleached shark's tooth scrim tends to let loose or stretch when painted. Lino filled scrim is the same weave as a shark's tooth scrim, but with an extra layer that makes it opaque. And then theatrical gauze is made of woven linen, which is similar properties to shark's tooth, and can be a more economical way to do a scrim, I believe. And then, do you have time to make a test flat? Because if you do, that will answer many of your questions throughout your process. A test flat can be a small piece of fabric, or it can be a small flat that is used to test out your processes for paint or starch to help you understand how it will look on the actual project. It may seem like using a test flat is taking time away from your drop painting, but if you're unsure of any paint treatment or process, you can practice it on the test flat instead of going blindly onto the main project and possibly wasting time and materials before you're sure of the outcome. All right, and are you ready to start painting? Great. Good. It's been 45 minutes of talking about everything but painting. But the painting process is a problem-solving skill. Even when you've done the research, practiced the method, things may not go as planned, and that's okay. The point is to be flexible and change when you know more information. Do your best to remain steadfast and calm. Pay attention to when things need to change or when you may have to start a paint process again and refine your methods. There are also countless ways to approach painting a backdrop, and different processes work for different people. And just like your plan of attack, breaking the project down into manageable steps will ensure a successful project. And that's it. Oh yeah, thank you for joining us. If you have more questions, since this was an overview and we only had 45 minutes to go over a very complicated process, feel free to email me and feel free to check out my website if you're curious. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
All right. Does anybody have any questions as we go forward? We had a couple questions that came in before. I'm going to go ahead and address one of them. Was we had somebody ask about translucent and painting, or translucent drop sand painting scrims. That's why Jamie had those slides in there. That is actually kind of sneaking a peek at a future webinar. That is on our list of things that we want to do one day. So we'll do a bit further of a deep dive into that. So if that was your question, keep tuned, we'll have more coming. Does anybody have any questions or comments on any of the tools that she used, or the idea of painting down versus painting up? I know a lot of us have exposure to both of those, so I'm curious to see if anybody has a preference to one and why. Crystal has a comment in the chat that says a pounce wheel can also be found as a Württemberg wheel. Now, I'd like to say if you're trying to search for it on the internet and you're not finding a pounce wheel, it's sometimes also spelled a ponce wheel, like P-O-N-C-E. So that can help. So 3 different options for looking for one of those guys. Is there a good technique for painting sky/clouds?
So there's several ways to paint skies and clouds. Just to go over some really quick ones, because a lot of these you could turn into your own webinar, just talking about clouds or just talking about, painting marble. You can use different ways of masking your clouds, such as using the muslin as kind of your cloud base. You can use kitty litter, where you actually lay the kitty litter down in the place that you want the cloud to remain. And then using a brush, you can kind of push the kitty litter around. Takes a little time. You got to be patient with it. And just know anywhere that kitty litter is not, your sky color is going to be on that surface. So just know that patience and, again, being methodical about it. You can use sawdust, but I believe kitty litter is preferred because sawdust can glue itself to the drop, which is not ideal.
I actually throw in there too. I had someone introduce me to cork instead of kitty litter, because I had trouble with, I'm in a high humidity area and I had trouble with the kitty litter sticking this summer. So there was lots of fun with the plastic scraper trying to get it off. When I was commiserating with a friend, they mentioned that they use cork because it keeps it from sticking. And I actually think that comes from Susan Crabtree.
That sounds correct.
Yeah. I want to say that.
Yep, I believe that's true.
I think it was Susan who mentioned that at USITT. So
You can also use batting, like what you would use to like stuff pillows. You can use batting for masking.
Is there any fear that'll get glued down?
Was that, sorry?
If you use batting, is there any fear that like little fibers would get?
I didn't see that happen when I saw it used.
Okay.
It also depends on how thick you are spraying. The thinner that your spray passes are, the less likely that's going to happen. Because with each spray pass, ideally, especially with kitty litter, you need to move that kitty litter around or you will get a very hard edge. So again, it's very much, you know, it's going to be a little bit of a reveal at the end how well you did, but you know, practicing on your test flat, practicing on the side of, you know, side of the drop is going to really help ensure that you understand your process before you just like start throwing kitty litter everywhere.
So I have a question about, does the paint frame keep the fabric rigid so it doesn't shrink in strange ways?
I mean, it is stapled. When I've used a paint frame, it is stapled very heavily, basically around the entire edge. And once you are starching it, as long as it is not flame retarded, I have noticed flame retarded drops do let loose if there's a certain amount of moisture put on them again. But generally, if it is a not flame retarded, stapled well drop that is starched well, it shouldn't have problems with it wrinkling.
So following up from that, what would you say a muslin should feel like once it's starched? Like how stiff should it be?
You should definitely feel a difference. It shouldn't be soft. All of the little fibers that kind of stick up off the drop, which kind of just like are little like fuzzy things, should all be matted down. It should feel very slick and very smooth. You're not necessarily going to be able to like bunch up a drop once you have it started. Like if it's on the ground, it's going to feel like it's a very hard flat surface. Whereas if it's on the paint frame, unless you can reach your arm around and like see how it's feeling, that would make the only way to really feel the difference. You'd feel it be soft on the back and then kind of hard and smooth on the front.
We had Aaron had popped in and said like, this is more of a conversational one. So I'm going to rephrase this as this is a cool tool that you should look for if you haven't used it. But if anybody's never experienced an electro pounce, like those are quite fun as an alternative to the pounce wheel method that Jamie was talking about. Jamie, do you want to describe an electro pounce really quick?
So when I have used it, so I've only seen it like once or twice. What I saw, it was a big magnetic kind of piece of metal on a wall. Maybe it was like 6 foot by 6 foot or something like that, with obviously its electrical box next to it. And it had a cable running to your electro pounce wheel. And I assume that you can hurt yourself with it but I'm not sure if you can. Like I said, I used it for 2 minutes, but it makes very small, fine holes in your drop. So I don't know if that's as much of an issue, but it does do it very quickly, which is kind of cool. So I imagine it just takes a more experienced hand once you understand, because you're really just like running this tool over your lines as opposed to pushing and perforating it. It's more of just kind of following the lines and tracing them.
Yeah, it's a fun one.
Yeah, I imagine it is faster in a lot of ways, and you can get adept at it just like anything.
Yeah. So Julian's asking, should both sides of the muslin be starched for a translucent drop?
So that is something I didn't go over. So great question, Julian.
But I'm go ahead and say I'm going to keep Jamie from answering this because we are eventually going to do one on translucent. So
the short answer is yes.
Depending on which of those types of drops Jamie had talked about, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because you can do a translucent drop that doesn't need to be starched on the back. But again, that's a future webinar. So I'm keeping her from sharing her knowledge because we might somebody back to do that one. So
and you can also check the article, the guild, because that may also give you some more insight.
I think the answer might be actually in there. So go to the scenic route and check out our articles on translucent drops. There's 2 different articles. She mentioned the one there's one about how to do translucent drops, and there's also one about a event that we had at USITT. So the answer could be between those. And Kim has some wonderful information going into the like general rule for working on a frame. She says that the general rule is to ensure that the drop is square and to approach it with the same thorough approach that you would on the floor. So the top frame where the drop is first stapled must be parallel to the bottom of the paint frame, and the sides of the frame can be squared with a plumb line. All 4 sides are stapled. So that kind of goes back to our question earlier about making sure that we don't have any crazy issues going on with the sizing and the stretching and all that jazz with our drop on a frame.
Yes, thank you, Kim.
So that takes us nearly to time. So if we don't have any further questions, then thank you guys for joining us. It was really nice to see you all. Again, keep your eyes tuned. We might have another one on part 3 of our drop series about translucent drops and scrims coming up in the future. Otherwise, have a great night and see you guys around later. Bye all.
Thank you, everyone.